Okay, I'm going to start to introduce ID. And so when I say ID, I mean IIT Institute of Design. IIT Institute of Design is located in Chicago, as I mentioned. We are located at the Illinois Institute of Technology. That's what IIT stands for. Here we work on building responsible, cooperative, intelligent futures. We were founded 80-some years ago by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy as the new Bauhaus, and we are known for pioneering human-centered design and systems design. We're the only design school in the US that's devoted completely to graduate students, and we offer an expansive approach to design education for the 21st century. So everyone here on this panel it has attended ID, as we refer to it, and they're from a variety of years and have gone into a variety of different positions. But I think that everyone here would agree that part of what is so great about ID is the community, which is part of your time in graduate school, but also extends to the ID experience, which continues after graduate school as an alum. So we consider ourselves an international community. And I'm going to hand it over to Roxanne, who's going to introduce herself. And many of our panelists today are foundation alumni. And so we have a particular part of our program that is called the foundation sequence, which is actually rooted very much in the Bauhaus. And so that is a way of getting folks who come from non-design backgrounds primed in some of the thinking and ways of approaching problems that come from design. So we'll learn more about that through the conversation today, but I'll hand it over to Roxanne Hoffman for now, who is a current student at ID and will introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Roxanne. I know there's two Roxannes on this call, and it's weird for both of us. I'm a Master of Design and MBA dual degree student. I also just finished my foundation curriculum, and I'm also design strategy intern at Fidelity right now. So like many of our alumni, prior to ID, I didn't have a design background. I studied mechanical engineering and worked in manufacturing for a number of years. So I'd like to welcome our 4 alumni. If you could each introduce yourself, when you graduated from ID, your discipline before ID, and your current role. We can start with Ewan.
Okay, thanks. So Ewan Duncan. Before ID, I came from a product design and engineering background. So Glasgow University, Glasgow School of Art, if you can hear a small accent. I was at ID a long time ago, 92 through 94. After ID, I went to Dublin. I was there for around 5 years. I've now been at McKinsey for 20 years, where over time I helped found and then grow our customer experience practice. And I'm now also leading globally our design practice. Most people don't know McKinsey Design as a group of about 500 designers, including a few from ID, among lots of other places that helps work on a lot of both physical product design and then a lot of digital work. Based in Seattle.
Thanks for sharing. Fernando, could you introduce yourself next?
Sure. I'm Fernando Lin. I'm a design director at Relish Works. I went to ID from 2012 to 2015. I did the foundation and the dual degree program. Prior to ID, like you, Roxanne, I was a mechanical engineer, mechanical and electrical engineer. I used to work with wind turbines. That proved not to be the path for me. And after ID, I went to work at Dublin for 4 years, and I've been here at Relish Works for a couple of years now.
Great. Roxanne, could you go next?
Sure. So my name is Roxanne. I did the foundation program, the main program from 2014 to 2017. Prior to ID, I was working in the nonprofit sector in international peace building. And then post ID, I did consulting with EY, and then now I'm in-house at MetLife, doing experience design, experience strategy there.
Great. And then last but not least, John.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Pugh. I think most recent graduate of this crew. I was at ID from 2015 to 2018, doing the foundation program as well as the dual degree, so Master's of Design and MBA. Prior to that, I was an entrepreneur, started my own business doing ski and snowboard clothing, technical outerwear. Company's called True. It's truegear.com, TREW, always plugging. Before that, I got my undergraduate degree in Chinese language. So always very interested in language and culture, which translated very well into studying humans and human behavior at ID. And now I am a strategic designer with BCG's Digital Ventures. So still some of an entrepreneur, but working with some big corporate partners now to start businesses. So great to be here.
Thanks. So just getting started. So how did you all learn about design and ID specifically? Roxanne, could you start?
Sure. So when I was working in the nonprofit I was at before ID, we were a global association, and we brought in a consultant to help us think through, like, if we got $1 million from a big donor, what would we do to push kind of the entire field of peace building forward? And this person was a design strategist, so she approached problem solving very differently than we did in the peace building field. And I worked with her directly for about a month, kind of coming up with a proposal for like an edge lab for peace building. And she kind of brought a lot of the thinking that ID teaches to the table when we were working together. And I just kind of fell in love with the approach to problem solving. It felt kind of much more effective than a lot of the tools we were using within our organization and field. And so I kind of knew I wanted to pivot from there, and then kind of did some research and was looking at a bunch of programs, and ID seemed like the best fit because it was so focused on kind of the hardcore methodology, and felt like you'd be really grounded in practice and ways of thinking.
Great. Yeah, Ewan, if you have any other different kind of perspective on how you found design and ID.
Yeah, so I mean, I came from the UK at the time. So I've been working for a short time in the UK in design engineering, and I wanted to get out of the UK to travel the world. And so I had two different opportunities. One was working for a consumer electronics company in Japan, and one ultimately ended up being ID. I looked at a whole bunch of different educational institutions. The reason why I chose ID was it had a unique program in design planning. So I was the first class to go through that program, and there was nothing like it anywhere that I could find anywhere in the world. And then the more I got to speak to people who'd gone to ID, I learned about more of the history. And so it seemed to be a great fit. So I ended up choosing between two very different places. But as I looked at educational institutions, I think some of the things Roxanne mentioned also came true in my research a long time before.
Awesome. Fernando, how did you find ID?
Sure. So I started studying mechanical engineering with the idea of eventually making a move to product design. I come from a family where there's graphic designers and product designers, so I knew that side of design. I didn't know about strategic design or human-centered design, any of that. And as I was looking for programs with product in mind, I stumbled after a Google search onto ID's site. It was a stroke of luck, I guess, because the approach seemed to make much more sense for me and for what I wanted to kind of like become than just product. And so that's how we landed there. A little bit of luck, frankly.
I had a similar path. John, and then how did you come from Chinese language and entrepreneurship to ID?
Yeah, so I was kind of at a point, we had a fundraise and kind of a natural exit growing our team. And I was looking at graduate programs, mainly MBA schools. I didn't really consider design school because I think at the time I thought it was more, arts focused, or I didn't consider myself a designer. I'd been working with freelance designers and hacking some stuff together on my own. And it was really kind of through a family member who's quite intimate with ID that I came to visit the school, and having visited some MBA programs and then learning how ID approaches problem solving, kind of like Roxanne said, it seemed like a much more intuitive, practical approach. And yeah, so that's how I ended up there.
Awesome. I know that there's probably some people on this call who don't really know what like the type of design we're talking about is, or design strategy. So maybe you could elaborate on what we mean by design strategy. Ewan, you mentioned design planning. Like, what did that mean to you, and how would you explain it to somebody?
So design planning was at the time somewhat unique in that it combined user-centered design, systems thinking, and business planning. And this is something which I think has become a lot more mainstream in the 25 years since. It was unique at the time. And I think, I mean, I gravitated towards it, because of that combination and because of the multidisciplinary nature of the work. And I found that's been incredibly applicable in professional career since. Dublin is very closely, has been closely tied to ID. So it's a very simple sort of jump. I think applying it to a McKinsey context, it is a far more business, or was a far more just business oriented organization. All the work we do now is multidisciplinary in nature also. And so I found it to be quite applicable in very different settings since.
Great. Does anyone else have any kind of different perspective on design strategy, or maybe how you'd explain it to someone who doesn't know?
Not necessarily a different perspective. I think it's more of an additive perspective. The way I like to think about it is it's really just strategy, but starting from a different place, right? Where traditional business strategy starts with like the hypothesis or something like that. Design strategy starts from the problem and the question to the users, with less of a solution in mind. So it's just getting to the same place, just from a different point. At least that's how I think about it these days.
Yeah, I can maybe add a real world example to that. Also additive, because I think, just as Ewan and Fernando were saying, it is a way to solve problems and a perspective to look at those. And, it seems very sort of common sense to think about it from the user's point of view. But working with a client recently who's very strong in engineering, we're designing a new solution for them and had sort of a nice UX experience. And one of the engineers on their team said, "Oh, this is so amazing. Normally we just start with what data we have available, and then we try to think about, how we would use it." And so it's become a really powerful way to kind of reframe how we want to, create the benefit, for the user who might actually be using this solution. So just to bring a real world example into it.
Awesome. In terms of making the decision to actually go to grad school, I'm sure it's different, from having worked before. John, you had a business, you still have this business or that you're plugging. So maybe you can kind of bridge that.
Yeah. So the business is still going. I started with my brother and he's running the company. I think our other partner had an MBA and sort of in that business, I remember thinking that I felt like going to grad school could kind of level up from the experiences that I was having in my own business and the challenges that we were facing. I felt like I could take that experience and, get some wisdom and some knowledge from others. And then together that experience with this new wisdom and knowledge and skills could, really set me up for the future. And also, I was looking at a career change, and graduate school is a great platform to get into a new career. I don't think I would have been able to do that without ID, whether it's just the skills, but also setting you up with, alumni or job opportunities. That was a real motivation for me. And I think, looking at the experiences I had before I went to ID, it was helpful while I was there to have faced some problems in our business. And then while I was at ID, I was thinking about, well, knowing what I know now, I might have done this differently with these new skills. And that was really helpful. And now in my current career, having both those experiences can kind of bring more perspective to those conversations, even though it is, like Ewan said, very multidisciplinary. So I rely on other team members that maybe have not had an entrepreneurial experience, but more corporate experience to balance out my own perspective and vice versa.
Great. I think that's an interesting pivot to what your expectations were maybe when you had applied and just started versus when you graduated. So what were you expecting to do when you're in design grad school or just started foundation and then the moment you left through the door? Fernando, what about you?
Sure. I think when I started, frankly, I don't think I had a clue about what to expect. I mean, I knew it was going to be intense. I knew it was going to be like something that I had to like, you know, work on and work on and work on. In terms of like the opportunities that would come out of that, I think I was a little bit more naive in that sense. I didn't really fully understand, and I think throughout the program that changed. No, at the end of the program. As I said, I think that clarity is built or was built for me, where I had a much better sense of like, okay, do I want to go into like more of a design strategy role or more of a product role or more of a UX role or a research role? But those paths, for me at least, I was coming in without that deep of a knowledge. And so ID helped me kind of understand that, understand the lay of the land.
Nice. And Roxanne, could you also talk about maybe your expectations before? I mean, working in peace building, you probably felt like a lot of fulfillment through that. So how did that change once you exited design school?
Yeah, sure. I think my early thoughts were that I would kind of come and do this program and then apply what I learned back into the peace building field to kind of, you know, improve the ways in which I was able to make an impact. I think very quickly that changed. You know, you get exposure to all of the different kind of venues where you can apply this type of thinking, and it just felt kind of like the world opened up a bit. I feel like also through exposure to you know, various partners that ID brings in through kind of the coursework, I was able to see kind of how far design strategy as a set of tools might take you, and what some of the other skills I might have needed to drive impact would be, right? So I think it's kind of beyond the methodology. It's kind of the ways of collaborating with kind of other people from different disciplines, the ways of explaining what we do effectively, communicating kind of new opportunities to people that aren't familiar with the ways that we think and work, all felt like pretty important skills to go out and do anything. So I ended up really just turning it into a career change as well. And ID was a very helpful platform to kind of make that transition. I think I was able to kind of like test out a lot of different, you know, applying design in a lot of different industries. Was able to do a bit of work while at ID, and the network is great as well. So kind of was able to meet people who were doing different types of work. So yeah, ID really blew up kind of what I thought I was going to do, and in a great way, and really kind of opened the door, I think, for like a lot of professional development, frankly.
Great. Yeah, it's definitely eye-opening. And even for me, I'm only finished my first year, and it's definitely learning something new every time I take a new class. I think since we all come from different backgrounds, it's interesting to know how you put on different hats at work, if you do, and then maybe how your perspective has changed on former work you've done. Maybe you can have John, since you were doing entrepreneurship and you're talking about having done the dual degree and working with multidisciplinary teams, you can talk about that. And then after Ewan, you can talk about how your design practices potentially changed and how you see design changing with your career.
Yeah, so I think if I understood your question, it was around the paths of design. Is that right?
Yeah, like wearing different hats, like you know, entrepreneur, Chinese language expert, designer.
Yeah, I think you know, really kind of in the role that I'm in now, being able to leverage my experience as an entrepreneur is kind of in a scrappy way of solving problems, and the skills that I learned at ID just enhance that in every way. I would say in each of the ways that we learn the different disciplines of design, you know, sort of multidisciplinary in a sense where, you know, I wouldn't consider myself a UX or UI designer, but I can do those things enough to get a prototype out the door, to learn something or to create a conversation that's going to progress or help solve this problem. I wouldn't consider myself a product designer, but I've learned enough about sketching and some things where I can put a rough example of something together to get that idea out there. I don't think I had those skills before in starting my own business. I think that the scrappiness maybe is there because it's all on you. You kind of have to figure it out as you go. So having more tools in the toolbox is definitely helpful. And then, with the MBA side, it's, can you prototype a business, whether it's a business model, on a spreadsheet in a way that's, maybe not as good as, the best financial analyst or something like that, but it's good enough to get the conversation going or the idea out there so that we can learn and start to have a better idea of what people might think about it and the future might look like with this thing in there. So I really do think about it as, building the tools in the toolbox in a sort of scrappy, good enough way to get something out and start getting feedback.
Great. Ewan, yeah, so that kind of more of like a long-term design perspective, how has that changed for you?
Yeah, so I mean, if I look over sort of, my career trajectory, if I take customer experience as a practice, which is now pretty well established, if you go back 15 years, it wasn't, because most organizations are organized functionally. Most customers experience companies across all those functions, and there's a whole bunch of misses and drops, which is why you now have customer experience journeys and the like. It turns out when you look at it that way, who's best positioned to think about things end to end and customer back is typically designers, UX researchers, design researchers, etc. So I think that's where I personally found design sort of coming to the fore. As we built the design practice at McKinsey, I think the thing that we have seen more recently is, I would say there's no better time to launch new design-centered or user-centered businesses. If you look at many of the unicorns out there, they're quite often design is in the middle, or more specifically the customer or the users in the middle. Designers are uniquely positioned to be able to say, well, what does this then turn into in terms of the right products and services? So I think, there's never been a better time to be a designer and to think of these, whether it's new businesses or new ways to experience products and services for an established organization. And so that's sort of the evolution from being design hidden in the background to, I think, now design being far more in the foreground in delivering outcomes for organizations. Super
interesting. Yeah. Every time I hear like a different company's perspective on design, there's something that's a little bit different. I think it might be good to get back to kind of what is foundation and what does ID do differently. So maybe we can talk a little bit about like what foundation is and how you would explain it to somebody and any challenges you had going through foundation. Roxanne, could you start?
Sure. So the way I'd explain foundation is a set of classes that gets you familiar with the different kind of practices of design. So communication design, product design, interaction design, and kind of really lets you get your hands dirty, kind of going through the work of doing that type of design. And for me, it was very valuable in just kind of building a more comprehensive understanding of what those practitioners do. Like, I'm not going to go out and be a hardcore like UX designer, but I know how to work with those folks much better now than I would have prior to ID, and I have a little bit more empathy for like the types of things that they're thinking about as they're creating, right? So not just kind of the work that they're doing, but the kind of the driving force, like the ethos behind the work, the thought processes, what matters to them, so that you can kind of have productive conversations. So, in terms of kind of managing design and planning design, that foundation year felt very important. Also, it's like a great way to bond with classmates because you are in the trenches working on like, a lot of stuff that's unfamiliar and kind of solving problems together. So from a relationship building perspective, it was super, super valuable there.
Yeah. There is a question in the chat I think is relevant to this. Is just, did you feel behind by being in foundation versus going straight to the MDes? It could be for anybody.
I can take that. Actually, no, I would say that being in foundation, when you get to the program, you're already familiar with the school, you're familiar with the classmates, you've flexed your muscle in different design, fields, and that props you up. I felt much better prepared to go into the program after doing foundation than if I hadn't. Plus, the other thing that I think is very valuable about foundation is that, you know, most people that are coming into foundation have a background in something. I had engineering, you know, and I had learned problem solving within the confines of engineering. And suddenly you're being asked to solve problems in a different domain than your own with a bunch of people that come from different backgrounds. And so they're all solving new problems in completely different ways. And you get to see that firsthand because they're your friends and they're there with you in the room. And I think that's, for me, that's one of the most valuable lessons in foundation is that, oh, there's so many different ways to approach this problem, each with their own advantages, each with really interesting results that come out of the breadth of experiences in the room. And so it kind of like erases this idea of like, well, I know how to solve this problem this way. Like, yeah, and that's one way out of how many, you know? So
I'll add to that, that another kind of benefit of foundation in kind of what Roxanne was saying is you get to learn the different disciplines of design. There was an intro to design course that kind of sets the history, some of the different disciplines now, and then you get to try out each of these things. It's one of the only times at ID that you do get to do a lot of the work on your own. There is group projects and group problem solving going on, but you do get a lot more time to work to try to learn yourself in terms of where you think your design skills might be. And I think it's a good mix of both that, trying to, you know, learn and practice something myself and working in this multidisciplinary team and problem solving, so that once you get into the main program, you have a better understanding of not only how you work in teams, but what your strengths and weaknesses are in those teams. So in the main program, when it's much more collaborative, you feel a little bit ahead that way in terms of the teaming, which I think, at least in my current role, my current job, and I think everyone here agrees, it's all multidisciplinary work right now. So it's kind of the, I don't know if it's the sort of Trojan horse learning or the secret learning of ID is learning how to work in teams on difficult problems, that once you get into your career, that's never going to go away. So I think that's a great benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just kind of segueing off of that, like after graduating, how did you find the experience of using, you know, design frameworks or just problem solving in these different types of teams? Ewan, or anybody, I guess, but actually it'd be good to hear from everyone.
I mean, I'll jump in quickly. So I went from ID to Dublin, which was a very natural transition. The transition to McKinsey was far different. McKinsey used to have a single problem-solving method. Fernando mentioned it earlier. What's your hypothesis? Get some data and analysis, and then move on to, you know, potential solutions. McKinsey now has 5 different problem-solving approaches it applies, one of which is a design-centric method of iteration, rapid prototyping, etc. And I think so the application is, it has changed what is a very large institution in its way of thinking. That's, I think, probably a pretty interesting thing to have observed over 20 years at one firm.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I think, so I went from ID to Dublin as well. And I feel like that transition was fairly, in terms of problem solving and applying what I just learned, fairly one-to-one. I think as I've progressed, one of the things that has become more and more clear is that, you know, the same thing that happened in foundation or when you go through ID about deconstructing what you knew before kind of happens afterwards about what you learned in ID. And it really becomes about how do you apply the different principles? Where do you break the process? Where do you actually double down on the process? And the process can be 1,000 things too. So it's like really learning how to navigate that and really think critically about why you're approaching a problem with from a particular direction. I think that's one of the things that, you know, you have to put in practice and get around the idea of how it actually works out in the world.
Yeah, I think somebody said once when I was ID, and I don't remember who, so I don't want to give false credit, but someone said, you learn a lot of frameworks and methodologies, but frameworks are like underwear. Everybody, you need it, but you don't want anyone to see it. And I think ID does a great job of, focusing on the problem you're trying to solve, and not so much on the framework you use to get there. And I think now that I'm in consulting, there's almost another emphasis on showing the underwear a little bit. People do like to see the framework and the process. So I think there's still some, I guess, some work to be done there in not over reliance on frameworks and things as the end result, as much as the benefit of getting to a unique and novel and sort of delightful solution. So that was one learning.
Yeah, I'd maybe add there's a translation element to the work that happens when you leave ID, right? Like in ID, everyone's speaking the same language, learning the same language. And to the point of like not showing your framework underwear, like, if you put a design framework in front of a business partner, like in a corporate environment, like it's not gonna resonate if they don't have that kind of same background in the kind of approach to problem solving. So, I think in most cases, you're gonna have to learn how and when to translate the way of thinking into whatever language kind of hooks resonate for the decision makers that you're working with. So that's always a thing.
Yeah, definitely kind of explaining yourself and reframing a problem is something that, designers live with, and it's not inherently just within the design domain. It'd be interesting to know your perspective on IEDs culture, anything that was compelling or really impactful when you were studying. We can start with you again, Roxanne.
Sure. I think that the culture of collaboration, which I think a couple folks on the panel have already spoke to, is the standout for me, and really kind of getting in the weeds with folks and working through problems and having your aha moments together that really anchor the learning. That feels like the biggest kind of cultural touchstone, and like showing your work and putting your work up as well. Feel like big aspects of the culture. So I'll keep it there. I'm sure others have.
Yeah, I think along the lines of like putting your work up there, the culture of critique, which I think is constructive criticism basically, which I don't think every field, I wasn't used to it. And I think that was really helpful to see how multiple people can help solve a problem that maybe is your problem, right? It's maybe about your work, but that's very helpful. And I would also add to what Roxanne said, there's also a culture of like, I experienced this of like just a lot of hard work and being there, and like camaraderie in that, spending 14-hour days working on something, but your classmates are there and you're kind of like tackling it all together. And that creates a good sense of, in some cases it's individual work, but you're all in there together. And even if you're not collaborating directly on a problem, you're all kind of like sharing ideas and collaborating on maybe on another level. And I really appreciated that. I like that part of the culture.
Yep, I would agree with all those points, and also that with that critique culture and the multidisciplinary nature and people coming from different backgrounds and checking your beliefs and your assumptions, there has to be a good culture of sort of psychological safety and people feeling comfortable to critique without being personal or having the best intentions in mind, and also you as yourself as a student coming in feeling comfortable knowing that your beliefs and assumptions could get checked by someone else's, and it's not something, an attack on you personally, but something that's designed to be a way to kind of move forward in the best way. And so I think there's always a challenging balance there that ID does strive to try to find, as it's so important in kind of the work that we do.
And John, I really like that point, because I think that's one of the things that, going back to an old question, one of the things that carries out most to my day-to-day today is that the work we do requires constant discussion and collaboration and disagreement, constructive disagreement, and being able to test ideas from multiple perspectives and poke holes in them, but being constructive. And I think that's a muscle that starts to get developed in a place like IIT.
I think the other thing you see a lot is the student body thinking critically about the curriculum and their experiences there. And I think people tend to be very engaged in what they want the program to be and how they want to see it evolve over time. And so I do feel like there were a lot of discussions about how, ID itself could improve to kind of create either a better culture internally or kind of fit the market in new ways or kind of emerging opportunities. So that's a constant discussion as well, which I think is kind of a bright spot for the culture.
Mm-hmm. Which I think comes from, introducing people to just start looking for problems and frictions
Yeah.
in their lives. It's only natural. They're going to want to look for ways to solve them.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of segue also into just advice for people considering design school. Like, what kind of skills or perspective do you need? Maybe not so much skills, but like we were talking about, this kind of openness to critique, or that willingness to just, look for things that you care about and try to work towards fixing them. Anything else? Like, Ewan, do you have any ideas?
I mean, look, the thing that is at the center of both ID's approach and design in general is putting the user in the middle and being that constant champion, empathetic to the end user, and then figuring out how to change, improve, or create something new around that. I think that is probably the core skill you want to either bring or develop, but it's something that is applicable to lots of fields later, whether it's in core design, design research, or more broadly.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was saying before about kind of learning your strengths and weaknesses, how you work in teams, what your perspective and assumptions are, and knowing them ahead of time so that you can feel comfortable balancing them, I think is all part of just a curiosity that you have to have, that's both before ID and then after, because things are changing so much, I think, in the field and in the world. And part of our job is to have our ears open to those things. And with that curiosity comes the next step of the getting your hands dirty. So I don't know anything about, building Arduino devices and things like this, but at ID, I got the opportunity to try that. And I never would have learned that that's something that I could do, and so you never really learn that until you try it. And I definitely spent a lot of time, reading books or blogs on design and human-centered design, and that's all very good. But then once you get into the actual practice of it is, I think, where the biggest learnings come. So not being afraid to get into the, trying stuff out, whether it's online, if it's UX, UI, tearing down products and redesigning them yourself, or, taking other people's challenges and thinking about how you might have done it differently, are all good ways to sort of flex those muscles before going to ID.
Totally agree. And we have a question. So kind of emotionally, what's the experience of pivoting to a designer and feeling comfortable that you identify yourself as a designer?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it was exciting, challenging. I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen to get to that point. Yeah, but I think it's a mix of just, for me, it was exciting. It was just exciting and fun, but it carried with it a lot of work and a lot of thinking and a lot of doing. It wasn't difficult to leave behind an engineering life for me.
Same.
I think empowering is like maybe another word you can throw into the mix if we're talking emotions, because it is like a confidence that you gain when you're able to effectively reframe a problem for the first time, or you feel like, oh, we kind of like we worked through a lot of like, you know, challenges when trying to address a problem, and, you know, maybe we're in the weeds and like kind of swimming through the ambiguity for a minute, and like, oh, we got to clarity, right? Like we kind of figured it out together, and now we have a solution, just keeping things like very general, that we feel confident about, kind of having used the tools that we've learned. So I do think kind of once you have used the methods in a way that feels kind of like true to the intent, you're like, yeah, okay, I have a new skill, like great, like I'm kind of proving to myself that I can think in this different way, and you know, it opens the world up a little bit. You start seeing things differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think emotionally it's hard in foundation when you first put your work up on the wall and you see how everyone else did a much better job than you at solving the same problem that you did. It can feel emotionally draining at times, but then there's other times where that becomes motivating. And I think, you know, I mean, one, I still struggle with considering myself a designer, but I think the moment that I do feel that way is when I have like looked at a problem from different perspectives and worked on it in a way where I've gotten to a solution that I feel is, you know, beneficial to the user and is kind of new and novel, and then can story tell it in a way where others can also have that same feeling and insight that I had in that process. I think it's in those moments where I feel like, oh, okay, I designed something new, and then people understand why I did it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So in lieu of time, we're going to move to Q&A, but we're also going to introduce a faculty member, Tamako Ichikawa, who's the resident communication designer. She teaches foundation courses in intro to visual communication. And I've definitely had that moment, John, where you're putting up work in that class and comparing it to other people's, and it's eye-opening. Welcome, Tamako.
Hi, thank you very much. Good to see you all. Ewan, it has been a long time, very, very long time. And I'm the one I'm one of the many faculties that's responsible for creating a lot of stress and angst in your lives while you were at ID, hopefully all for the better. And I'm also the one that asked the question about, you know, the pivoting of when you started to self-identify yourself as a designer, because I see that struggle with foundation students who come from a different background, and their trajectories are very different from the MDes students who already come as a designer. And as an instructor, I want to be sensitive to that experience, whether it's happening while they're at ID or whether it's a progression in a sort of a longer experience that happens while at ID and then afterwards, as to when you are able to sort of see yourself as a designer. So thank you for the various comments that you responded with. I'm just really glad to see you all. That was my question, so I don't have another one yet, but if I do think of one, I will. I myself am also from a non-design background, and was sort of a foundation student before the foundation program actually existed. So I took base classes with freshmen when ID still had an undergrad program, as well as with sophomores. And I think, so in a way, what I did was a precursor to the foundation program that you guys were able to leverage. So we're sort of all on that same path. But I think the point about multi-perspective, by bringing in the different ideas and viewpoints, was something that our previous dean had deliberately wanted in the graduate program. Patrick Whitney wanted 50% of the student body to be from a non-design background. And so in order to assist you all who come with that background to become designers, a formal foundation program was founded, I believe sometime in the 90s, when we went to all graduate program. Otherwise, you would have been taking classes with freshmen and sophomores too. But yeah, so thanks for having me here today. Roxanne, I think there was another question from another student from Ushwal that Kristen had mentioned.
Yeah, so managing the flexibility of the program. If you don't know a lot about the program, there's a lot of electives. There's usually not a lot of prerequisites. So the order in which you take them can be very flexible, but also kind of daunting if you don't know what you want to do. So it'd be interesting to know how some of the alumni decided to choose which courses to take and manage that flexibility.
I can take a stab. So I think that for me, it was kind of like an ongoing conversation with my peers, like other students, getting a sense of like people that had already taken the class and trying to understand what they had learned. Also with faculty and understanding what the focus was. And then with myself, really trying to understand what was the focus that I wanted to have once I was out of ID, you know? I think that was the most ambiguous one, because I really didn't know for a good portion of maybe the first couple of years. In foundation, that's not an important question because the curriculum is set, at least it was when I did it. I think the question is really, where do you want to focus on? And then based on that, how do you, getting the information from your classmates and from your faculty to really create that path.
Yeah, and also having the flexibility to try a lot of different things, because in grad school is one of those rare times where you get to try a lot of different things, and then you get into your career and you tend to focus a little bit more. So that was helpful. But I agree with Fernando's. Foundation's pretty set, and then as you get into the subsequent years, some things are set. There's some flexibility, and you might feel the pressure to, if you already know that you want to be a communication designer, you focus on communication design. But I certainly would encourage the having the flexibility to try a bunch of different things. And then if there's that, second year or in your summers and in your internships, trying to really decide on, what speaks to you the most.
And I feel like beyond what speaks to you, like there's an element of it that's going to be, what are you naturally good at? Like, where do you find your flow? And you're gonna, at least that's kind of the way that I ended up choosing. It was like, great, like here's where I feel like my comparative strengths are. Here's the way that my brain kind of naturally works. So let me like double down and have this be kind of the thing I can use as I go out into the job market to say, like, this is the type of designer that I feel like I am, and here's where my strengths are. While then also getting exposure to other ideas. I think that is really important.
Great. And then maybe from a kind of curriculum perspective, Tamako, how do you kind of prepare people who are both entering foundation and then also exiting foundation into the regular curriculum? How do they prepare for that?
Sure. So as an academic advisor, especially for foundation students or anyone that's new to the program, I like to spend quite a bit of time early on to understand like where they're coming from, why they came to ID, and what they want to do afterwards, so that I can help connect them from getting from point A to point B or D. There might be lots of points along the way, and how to navigate that through the courses they take. At the Institute of Design, I believe currently there are 7 required classes for the MDes program. And so in addition, other than that, everything else is electives, right? And so being able to understand, because some students, who come into the foundation program, they know very specifically, like, I want to be a design researcher, I want to be a design strategist. And then there are others who, like I'm very enamored by the design concept, and I would like to learn more about it and see where my career might take me. So we have a range of students who come in, but really understanding what the goals are and having them sort of envision what they want to be doing afterwards, like really specifically, like what kind of company do you want to work for? What area do you want to work for? Do you want to be in-house, or do you want to be a consultant? Asking those questions in advance to help them navigate through ID and all the different sort of categories of classes that one might be able to take is something that I very intentionally do. And I think also over the last year or so, the classes have been categorized in a way that helps to match more with not necessarily industry expectations, but sort of kind of using some of the language and concepts that might be seen in industry, like leadership or product management, or, so trying to help the students be able to match what classes are they going to take, and what is that going to give them in terms of skills that's going to match to what they do afterwards. So.
Wonderful. We're going to have one question left. How do you explain to people what design is and what you do career-wise, maybe kind of on a day-to-day level? We could start with Ewan.
I mean, my simplest view of what design is taking a user-centered perspective to create the new. You know, it's different from, it is a synthetic profession versus an analytic profession, which I think is uniquely applicable now because it is easier to create new things now than ever, whether it's digital or physical, with a whole bunch of different things existing. In terms of its applicability, obviously you've got a few different consultants on the line here. Roxanne is in-house. I mean, more organizations are building design organizations and capabilities because of those skills. There's been a massive push in both fields to sort of expand the growth of design and the applicability of design. And I think, you know, John might be able to talk about like the applicability of design to, you know, entrepreneurial endeavors, but I personally think there's never been a better time as a designer to create new businesses, because you can create the new, so you can obviously create a business system around that. So I think you can take it in lots of different places.
Great. I don't want to, you know, go over time for anybody, but just want to, you know, thank everybody for joining. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. Thanks to our panelists for sharing your journeys and stories about IED. And, you know, watch out for other IED announcements, fall events. There's definitely a lot of information sessions you can tune into if you're still looking for more information on design. Yeah, any last words?
No, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really great. Good to see you, Tamako.
Likewise, it's great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Don't be a stranger. we're in virtual world now. We can meet up anytime. Thanks for organizing this.
Okay.
I think this was a really great session.
Yeah, there's always so many more questions to answer, but it's, you know, it's at a certain point, kind of need to dive in if you're really that curious, I think.
Okay.
All right.
Enjoy your Wednesday.
Yeah.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody. Have a great day.
Everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.